to start a Hispanic ministry alongside Riverside Presbyterian Church that itself was a church plant like 7 years before that. And it really started by someone asking a question. So Riverside was having a picnic at the park, and they saw a lot of Latino community in there, and they asked the question, so I see there's a lot of Latinos here. What are you going to do about it? And I think that question just kind of sat with them for about a year or so as they began to try to figure out what that meant. Fast forward 12 years later, when I first got that phone call from Brian, my gut reaction was, wow, that sounds exciting. Hung up the phone and said, no thanks, not interested. And it wasn't not interested, not because I didn't like what they were doing, but I lived in Southern California. We drive to the snow, you don't live in the snow. So, it's just a little different. But I think God had another.
And your fiancé lived in Southern California.
And my fiancé lived in Southern California at the time. Actually, when we first started dating, one of the things that I said, hey, and I think the slim possibility is kind of what's sold in there. So, thank you, Sean, for asking me to share about what we've learned. And so he asked me to talk about one of our ministries that started about 11 years ago called Lunch for the Soul. And what I will do is I actually will talk about Lunch for the Soul and Ignite. And I'll explain to you a little bit about it. But more than anything, we'll use those two examples to share what we've learned in this 12 years. And it's this: walk, stop, listen, and repeat. So we walk, we stop, we listen, and repeat. What that means for us is that really, as we walk, it's really being in community. Are we willing to go outside our comfort zone? Are we willing to go outside into our community, not for the sake of recruiting, not for the sake of converting, not for the sake of our benefit, but really just to be in the community? And I think sometimes that's hard, especially when we are having to answer questions from how many people are gathering, what's your budget, what's your long-term goals. I mean, all these metrics, all those tangibles that we have to respond for. We have to be good stewards of, and theologically and missional, and we have all these reasons of why these things are important. But I think one of the challenges that we have as a church now in the 21st century is that we really have to redefine what church is. And not for us, and not for our book of order, but for what it really means in the community. Not so we have this great graphic, not so we can have a new definition, not so we can create more documents that we're going to shelve and not pay attention to, but really, what's this new definition of church that we are willing to live into? Sean talked about that one part that hopefully is not out of the book of order yet, where we are called to serve even to the point of death of its own church. So one of the things that we have, one of the sayings that we have here at Riverside is that Sunday morning is not the most important thing we do, but everything else we do every week, the rest of the week. Now, I'll be honest, that's really easy to say when you're in an environment like this, when you're talking about it, when you're teaching about it, but when you have a community and only 7 of them show up, you're like, what happened? When you're starting to do something and trying to figure out what this looks like, and all of a sudden you don't have the response that you were hoping for, you're like, what happened? But I think it is, as Edwin said, it is that conviction of, is the community trying to save us from our own perspectives and our own understanding of what church is? So I want us to, as we walk, the walking component is what we do every day. So mission is less about people coming to church, but more about church being sent to be with people. So 11 years ago, when we land here, one of the main things that is happening is this controversy of a day labor site in Sterling, Virginia. If you look at newspapers or news from, we actually made the national news because in the middle of all this, the Minutemen decide to get involved and protest this day labor site. Now, the interesting part about Lunch for the Soul and how it started is that even though I was the one maybe who had passion for it, there were other partners that had passion for it, we weren't really the ones who started doing the work. We just kind of happened to walk into a specific invitation, but all the work had been happening even before I landed here. So one of the things that I think we need to discover is that God is really at work in the community. And all we really need to do is pay attention. Respond to those invitations. I think there's a part that we're really excited and want to be out in the community, and we'll do that for a short time. But after a while of not getting traction or not seeing any fruit, we just stop. Because it takes a lot. It really costs a lot. Especially when you have a 3-year grant. And if it's month 6 or 7 and you have nothing to show for, you start panicking. And you start just trying to figure out, okay, maybe, then I'm just going to gather. And now I'm just going to try to figure out, and you try to force things rather than really just continuing to walk and waiting for that invitation. So there was this corner on Eldon in Alabama in Herndon, Virginia, which is 10 minutes from us geographically. Coming from Los Angeles, where, you know, anything that you want to get to is like a drive it could be 17 miles or it could be 5 miles, and it'll take you anywhere from an hour to an hour and a half, depending on traffic. So having seen all this and having it 10 minutes away and having people say it's too far from where we're at, I could not understand that. But honestly, I think that's been a good lesson and a gift. So there was this group of guys who were trying to organize a day labor site. Reston Interfaith, Trinity Presbyterian Church, and a bunch of other churches were pretty involved in trying to get this day labor site going. And the invitation was we're doing. So one afternoon, I showed up, and the invitation from the center director was this: is any church willing to do something or has an activity for someone to do something at 11 o'clock in the morning? Because what happened was, at 11 o'clock, the center had to close. And one of the agreements for this center to operate in the city of Herndon was that they could not go back to the streets and solicit work anymore. So at 11 o'clock, generally 85 or so men, mostly men, had nothing to do. So when you're just arriving and you see a bunch of people gathered and somebody says, is there anybody who would like to do something? You're like, yes, we'll show up. We'll do something. And that's where this idea of Lunch for the Soul started. Because here was my passion. I loved people, and I loved to eat. But I think the part that I didn't quite get was that as much as we wanted to do this, we actually started for the wrong reasons. So we showed up, we pitched this idea to the session at Riverside, pitched the idea to our partner church in Herndon. Both of them were very excited, blessed it, sent us forward, talked to the center director. The center director was excited, and I printed the flyers, and I started showing up with donuts at the center. So every Wednesday, for like 3 weeks before we actually started, people were excited because I was showing up with donuts. People were excited because I was showing up and talking to them. So in my head, I'm like, we got it made. People are excited. Who would not want a free meal? So the day that we started Lunch for the Soul actually came. And instead of having 85 people get in the van or the cars and we transported them to Trinity Presbyterian because it was a lot closer to them, we had 5. And I was disappointed. And I think it's been years in the unpacking that I understand why I was disappointed. Because it had nothing to do with the numbers. It had everything to do with my expectations and my identity in this project. So often we start things that we are passionate about, and I think we need to start with passion. But we need to do it for the right reasons. See, the free meal wasn't really a free meal. That was just a bait. That's what we were just trying to give away so people could come and do our thing. So often we start churches because there's something we want from others, not something that we're so willing to give ourselves away for. And I think sometimes we need to start changing that. And I think it really was until we really began to appreciate the time that these 5 participants gave us and really sit with them and get to know them, that the word really began to spread, to pass around. Because it really was no longer just about us gathering people and me being able to put numbers down, but it really was about this gathered community that needed more community first and Jesus second than something I was trying to sell them or trying to convince them of. So we start with passion, but we have to do it for the right reasons. And the right reasons is not for our success. It's not so I can look good. It's not so look at what we're doing with day laborers. And you fill in the blank with whatever that group is there. So we had to stop. As we were walking and we're being invited, the hardest part for us to do sometimes is just to stop and be with someone. You can't fake relationships. You have to spend the time. We could have been offering $100. We could have been offering whatever the one thing is that we were gathering people, and maybe people would have shown up. Maybe we would have had more people come, but it would have never lasted. It would have never grown deeper. It would have never been community. Because it was about more a transaction than really just being community. In the process of being, we got the privilege of meeting people and learning people's stories and learning about what really it is that they're searching for, that they're longing for. One of the things that we discovered, his name is Joaquin. And Joaquin was a former Salvadorian army person who struggled a lot, who had to flee El Salvador to kind of discover or save his life or rediscover who he was. And one of the things that I learned about him is that he would be willing to, during the summer months, live outside, so whatever little money he had, he could send his kids. It was one of those things that it kind of really began to shape me and began to challenge why we do, the importance of doing what we're doing. That it no longer became how are we doing with Lunch for the Soul and how do we transition them to our church. But rather, how can we make sure that 11 o'clock, at 11:30 on Wednesday mornings, that's their church. One of the things that began to happen was a lot of the guys would come very early on, have the meal, and then leave. Some of our volunteers were like, they're leaving without worship. And we had to say, it's okay. And we intentionally started with meal first and worship later, because we didn't want anyone to feel like they were a captive audience because we were there for the meal afterwards. So here's one of the challenges for us as new worshiping communities. And I think it really is to ask the question, who are we doing this for? Or what is this about? Is it for us to feel good? Is it for us to serve a need? Because I don't think we're called to gather people to take care of their needs. Now, that sounds weird, and then you're probably looking at me like, wait, what? No, it's like, yes, we serve the needs, but we serve them for the right reasons. We don't gather the people just for us to be charity. We gather people for us to be the community. And we value people because we both have something to teach and learn from one another. I think Joaquin eventually moved to Florida where it was warmer longer. And I think the part for us has continued to challenge me is, what could we have done differently with Joaquin so he didn't have to be in that situation? Gathering community is exciting. It's fun to show you pictures like this. This is a Christmas Eve worship service where all the Lunch for the Soul community, Riverside community, and Trinity community come and worship, and we have this wonderful celebration. But when we ask you to come, we ask you to come not to serve the food. We ask you to come to sit with and worship with. And that makes a big difference. Because it's really safe to sit behind a table and give someone something. And yes, you did something good and you fed somebody, but it will not change your life. I had a man who showed up one time and said, hey, these are my political beliefs. This is what I believe about immigration. I don't think you need to be doing this. And we're like, okay. We do believe that God is calling us to do this. I respect you. I respect your political beliefs, but I believe that Jesus really is calling us to do something bigger than just an agenda. This person shows up on Thanksgiving celebration with his son, and I look at him, and in the back of my head, I'm going to have to be very honest, and I said, oh my gosh, this is not going to go well. But he shows up, and to his credit, engaged, served, sat, ate, worshipped. And next Tuesday, he showed up again. These are my political beliefs. This is my immigration belief. But I have a bigger problem now. I met them. And I don't know what to do with it. See, I think sometimes the transformation that we're seeking in our hearts and in our community has nothing to do with theology. It has everything to do with relationships. And I think new worshiping communities have really the power to transform whole communities together. I've always said that I wonder if we stopped serving the meal, which we won't, would people still gather? And I think they would. Eventually that center closed, and really we thought, okay, we're done. There's no more gathering of people. But because now they're free to go back into the street, back to the 7-Eleven and stay as long as they need to. But then 2008 happened. And the economy tanked. And all the construction in this richest county in the United States with the big growth and everything came to a halt. And in beautiful days of spring, where we would have no one show up or very little, we had 180. It would take us almost an hour and a half to pick everybody up, take them to the church, serve the meal, and then we would do worship. And no one left. And they stayed, and no one complained, and everybody was patient. Because I think they really began to feel like they belonged. We love to use this term in the Presbyterian Church. Everybody welcome. But I think when we say everybody welcome, that means if I welcome you to my house, you're welcome to come and be. But there are certain rules and there's certain regulations and there's certain behaviors and there's certain expectations. Or I'm going to welcome you for a week, and after that, I don't know. But what if we were able to switch from everybody welcome to you actually belong? Because then the change is not on you. The change is on me. For us to really begin to adapt, to engage our community. So here's a big concept. Listen. It's easy for us to stop, and I think it's we're even willing to stretch a little bit more and be with people. You know, I could say, I'll show up on Wednesday, we'll serve the meal, we're together, but we're done. I'll go back and I'll come back next week, and every week we'll do this process again, and we'll go through this exercise together again. But to actually listen and to stop really thinking of what my solution for your problems are or my solution for your situation is, actually start having you dictate what is the activity that we as a community need to do. What if your visionaries and your leadership team is not part of the people that you meet on a regular basis, but rather the people that come to your gatherings? So as we listened to the community, it wasn't so much about who are we and what is it that people really need. So one of the things that we discovered is that regardless of what your ethnic background is, regardless of what your economic status is, regardless of what your immigration status is, we all have certain things in common. And seeing our children do better is one of those things that translates well in any language and in any community. Riverside had this thing called Camp Sunrise, or Sunrise Camp, which in a sense is our vacation Bible school. And we used to have it at the park where we were asked that question about what we're going to do with the Hispanic community. And at that time, it was successful. We had about 100 and something kids show up. But we began to also do some work with Sugarland community. Now, Sugarland community, it's within our Cascades area. But if you don't live there, you can just drive by and never see this little community there. And as we began to do some of the work there, we began to notice that there were a lot of kids who either came home to an empty household because their parents were probably working 2 jobs, trying to make ends meet. And we were able to start with the partnership of the school, an after-school program, which we called Afternoon Adventure. So that year, we began to wrestle with the whole concept of, okay, so this is part of our community. It's not just language. It actually is within our boundaries, geographically boundaries of who we are and what we're called to do. What are we going to do? We could rent a bus. We could offer scholarship money. We could go pick them up. Or we can actually move our camp into the school. And instead of making someone fill out a paperwork for a scholarship form, we're just going to make it free for everybody. Whether you can't afford it or you don't, because it doesn't matter. And our camp began to grow. Our last numbers of camp where we had 420 something kids, about 200 and something volunteers, and it's been exciting. And it's been life-changing. And out of that, I think one of the parts that we have discovered is that after Afternoon Adventure happens, we were graduating these 5th graders into nothing. So then we began what is called Ignite. Ignite is a gathering for middle school and high school students at Sugarland Elementary. And we're gathering probably about 40 or so kids every Thursday night for open gym and mentoring and teaching. And we're beginning to see a little bit of crossover with the kids. Because one of the goals and one of the realities is that a lot of these kids go to school together, but we don't worship together. So how do we, instead of finding a way of coming here only, how do we get the church to be in their community? Now we're looking at the possibility of on Thursday nights, once a month, starting the community meal. So in a sense, it's going to be our third worship service. There's going to be one on Wednesday. It's going to be our fifth worship service. We have 3 on Sundays, 1 on Wednesday, and possibly 1 on Thursday. And how do we see this people, this community, not as us and them, but how do we really see this as this is the worship service that we have on Thursday, and it is our community. This is the worship service that we have on Wednesday, and it is our community, whether they contribute, our members, or not. But it's who God is calling us to do and be. And we repeat. Because one of the things that happens in new church development, or new worshiping communities a lot, is that once we have going with something, we get so preoccupied and so busy with sustaining that, we stop walking the community. We stop being with people that are not part of our community. We stop listening. So Lunch for the Soul now, it's in its 11th year. And we've gone through having 5 people, having 180 people, having 10 people, trying to figure out what do we do with it next. And one of the things that we have noticed is that we don't have as many day laborers in the community anymore. A lot of them have either, because of the political realities of the country living now, are either moving away or not coming anymore. But there's also a significant amount of them who have actually established community here. Now are married, possibly having kids, but still part of this greater community. So how does Lunch for the Soul then become not just a Wednesday thing, but an evening thing? How do we begin to gather these kids? What church? Because even though we're 10 minutes away, like I said, we're too far away. What church steps in and fulfills that role? Because this is not ours. It has to be the community's. It has to be someone else's. So we're not building this so we can get the next grant, so we can be self-sustained. We can be this because really it is, we're in this period of time where God has given us this particular community as stewards. But we need to prepare it so we can then pass it to the next group. How do we continue to release? So I said at the beginning that I've been here for 12 years. I was called to start a Spanish-speaking new church development that was parallel to Riverside. And the goal at that point was to be one church that worships in 2 languages. About 3 years or so into it, it happened. We actually chartered as one church. So our little tagline is we're one church that worships in 2 languages. But one of the things that we have discovered along the time, this period of time and in the relationship, is that Hispanic ministry wasn't the goal. Excuse me. And Edwin and I were talking about this. Hispanic ministry is the bridge. Because really, these kids now that play basketball together, that go to camp together, that do fundraisers together, that now are beginning to come to Sunday school together, that go to school together, this is their church. It's no longer just based on language and ethnicity. This is who we are. This is my church. These are our pastors. And that church is going to look very different 5 years from now. But if we're not stopping, listening, walking, and repeating, we will miss it. Because the changes that we need to do and the things we need to do and the engagement we need to do has to happen 3 to 5 years before you actually see that change happen. We need to, within our structure of the church, begin to change and begin to engage the communities, so then in 5 years, these kids who now, like my son the other day was telling me, I'm going to be in middle school and I'm ready to go to camp. Like I moved here, I didn't have any kids. I wasn't even married. But this is his church. And this is his friend's church. And this is his baseball teammates' church. So how do we release that? How do we really embrace that we're here for a period of time? I think one of the biggest challenges for our ethnic churches, and again, it's not that we were geniuses in this, we're kind of stumbled into some of these things, learning in the process, is that first generation churches always have a shelf life. And yes, there's always an influx, and yes, there's always, but what happens to their kids? What happens to this community? How come we can continue to evolve? And how can a Spanish-speaking church really begin to be the church not of just the Spanish speakers of this particular group or this particular community, but begin to embrace all of our communities? So I think that's something we've learned. I think we need to keep walking. We actually need to stop. We need to listen. And we need to keep on repeating. Thank you.
Anybody have questions for Edwin? Like Brian might have questions for Edwin.